Everyone. Thank you, David. Welcome everyone. I'm really excited to have my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Laree Kiley, here with us. Laree, I really want to thank you because it's 8 o'clock here Eastern time, but it's 5 a.m. in California. I know you're an early riser, but I owe you. Okay.
Roger, you're the only person on earth I would have done this for. No, I don't. I've been looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it.
So glad you're here. So glad you're here. So can we just go around real quick? And we have some new folks. So just tell us who you are and just kind of what you do. So if we can start with Dr. Yates. David, over to you first.
Hello, everybody. Most of you I've seen before or know via other means. I am Robin to Roger's Batman, or Boo Boo to Yogi, or you can pick your duo there, right? But I help Roger. We team teach classes, and then I help him with technology in our facilitations. And it's great to see all of you again this morning.
Thanks, David. Thanks. You go down to Michael Smith. Michael.
Hello, everyone. I am an internal medicine doctor in Omaha, and I teach improv theater to healthcare professionals and anyone who will listen, actually. And I met Roger through mutual connections at TEDx Omaha, and been enjoying some conversations about some of my other academic activities. I do a mystery case of the week for medical students as well, and a lot of Roger's material has been very useful in enhancing that.
Good to see you, Michael. Good to see you. Welcome. Dan Sheehan.
Also, you have a Peloton.
I do.
I'm a huge Peloton fan. I'm outside, but mine's inside. I'll be on it a couple times today.
Oh, that's good. I wish I was on mine more. It's more than a coat hanger, but not quite as much as I'd like to use it.
At least twice a day. I love it.
That's great.
Dan,
I'm Dan Sheehan, a pediatric pulmonologist. For many years, I was in Buffalo as an associate dean for medical curriculum.
Good to see you, Dan. Good friend. And then our Peloton king, Dr. Robert Gatewood.
Yeah, I'm a semi-retired cardiologist, and I'm a Roger groupie. I'm really excited to hear Laree's talk on systems, because that's one of my favorite topics.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
Great, Robert. Thank you. Charity, we'll just go over to you. Just a quick hello from you, Charity.
Hi, Charity Bergio. I'm the manager of learning and performance for Kaleida Health in Buffalo. Met Roger through some collaboration with Dr. Snyder for the UBMD students. And we also orient new residents to the organization.
Welcome, Charity. Great to see you. Got some cool stuff coming up I want to share with you, and I'll circle back around to you on that. So
excellent.
Good. Yeah. Anna, over to you. Josie, yes. All right, yeah. Not able to hear you. There we go.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Dr. Anuradha Joshi. I'm working as a medical professor in a Western medical school. And currently, I'm the student of Dr. Roger and Dr. Williams. I'm into the CPS program. And I really feel blessed to be a part of this community. Thank you so much for adding me.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you for your work. Yeah. Michael Leonard, over to you.
Morning, everybody. My name is Michael Leonard. I'm a pediatric hospitalist by training, and I'm the chief safety officer at University of Rochester Med Center. Actually started my medical career with Dan in Buffalo before Kaleida was Kaleida, believe it or not. So
wow.
I'm happy to be here this morning.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. You've read Dr. Kiley's bio. I'm not going to be able to have the time to do that. I need more than an hour to read her bio. So, dear friend, colleague, worked together for many years. So friend of mine, friend of the families. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Laree Kiley. So round of applause for Laree. Okay.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me this morning. I've been thinking so much about, gosh, there's a lot to cover in systems theory, and you all are very, very savvy and understand it anyway. If you're in healthcare, for example, you have to understand systems because the human body is a system, right? And of interacting and interdependent parts and all of that. So, but Raj wanted me to give you a little information about it, and then you can take it and run with it in these meetings as you go forward. It's also directly related to creativity, of course, because this understanding a system means you would understand where the snags might be in the system and where and that you can treat a symptom or you can treat a root cause, those kinds of things that I'm sure you all understand. So let me just share a couple of slides with you. I'll actually send these to Roger so he can send them out to you if you want them. But I feel like I'm sort of in with a bunch of people who really already understand systems theory. But let me give you a little bit of what I teach to my grad students and also to all of my clients, because I teach leadership in organizations. And organizations, as you well know, really don't exist. There's no such thing as an organization. It's a bunch of people trying to get stuff done. And a bunch of people trying to get stuff done who are interconnected and interdependent. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. One of the things we're working on here in California right now that some of you may be aware of is that they're doing what's called a redetermination of Medicaid coverage on several million people here in the United States. Everybody who's on Medicaid has to reapply. And trying to navigate that system here in California is what we're trying to do. We spent most of yesterday trying to figure out how are we going to reach all of the people in this system so that they know how to get back into the system. Just as an example of people not understanding how systems work, we were talking about it. Somebody said, well, send an email out to everybody. And I said, wait a minute. The people who need to get back on Medicaid are not the ones who necessarily have internet. And frankly, you're not going to be able to reach them by the internet. We've got tribes out here that have absolutely no bandwidth whatsoever in terms of internet. So, not necessarily understanding the interconnectedness of things and the disconnectedness of things. So I just brought you a little kind of simple way of taking a look at systems, and I'm going to share my screen here. Then we'll do some questions, there's some comments, there's some conversation about what all this means. But this is the stuff that I teach to my docs out here and the people in the healthcare system around leadership. So my expertise in systems, of course, which came from physics, it came from a combination of things, physics and Buddhism, and I mean, you name it. If you know who Fritjof Capra is, he's the one that took physics because he was a physics person and connected it to all kinds of other things and started writing about systems theory, although it's been around for a long time. But if you want to read something about it, Capra's books are fantastic. They're hard to put down. They're just incredible. So I teach this as leadership and thinking in systems. But today, in order to see all this, we're going to have to go to the balcony for a little bit and get out of the dance, because the dance is the system. But understanding systems theory is getting in the balcony and taking a look at the patterns in the dance. Because, as human beings, it's very difficult to see the patterns when we're in the dance. So we have to step back and be able to see what the patterns are so we'll know where things are going well and where things need to be fixed. But basic traditional thinking, as you well know, is pretty left brain and it's linear, right? But systems thinking is more like, the linear thinking is A, B, C, D, E, but systems thinking is more like A, duck, dog, Q, for house. It's like connecting all the things that are not linear at all, because we are so interconnected in so many ways that trying to figure out the interconnections really can help us understand what's really going on. So, one thing that we tell people is you can't just go do stuff. I mean, anything you go and do is going to have an effect on everybody else. It's anything you put out there that anyone else is aware of or has an effect on anybody else. You can't just go do stuff. That's the willy-nilly approach, because the things are all connected, because systems thinking is a discipline for seeing wholes rather than static snapshots for understanding the interconnectedness that gives living systems their unique character. Peter Senge writes a lot about this in terms of organizations. So there are lots of people in different fields that have captured the expertise in that field around systems thinking. So yeah, there are lots of words on these slides, but just some of the components of systems thinking. that we know, whether it's a living system, a human system, a natural nature system. I mean, everything out there pretty much is systems. A car engine is a system. A piece of bread is a system, right? And if you eat a piece of bread making this, it's a recipe, and the recipe is a system. And if anything's missing, or you're cooking it at the wrong temperature or whatever else, then you won't have the outcome of the piece of bread. Then you put the piece of bread in a toaster. Now you've got a whole other system. And then I eat the piece of bread, and I've got a whole other system that's being affected simply by a bunch of flour and eggs and things like that. So all parts must be present for the system to achieve its purpose optimally. Otherwise, it's just a collection. If you're looking at human systems, it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, because human systems, when we are interdependent, when what I do has a major effect on what you do and vice versa, that's a system. I'm a retired professor, and I would suggest to you that professors in a department are not a system. We're just a collection, because for the most part, professors really are not interdependent with one another. We just do our own thing, right? And that's part of the difference between what is a system where people really are interconnected and interdependent versus a bunch of independent people being in the same place at the same time. So the parts have to be arranged in a specific way for the system to achieve its purpose. Otherwise, again, it's just a collection. It's just a bunch of stuff. Systems serve specific purposes within larger systems and so on, but systems are dynamic. And this is like part that I think we have to pay attention to always, is that they're dynamic. They're always either living or dying, but they're always striving for stability and balance. They're always looking for equilibrium. And if you look at our political system, what's going on right now, it's looking for equilibrium, but because it swung so far one direction, now it's swinging really far the other direction in order to try to find equilibrium. Equilibrium is not necessarily a good thing. It's just that it's what systems try to do, is to find balance. But they also adapt and take the path of least resistance, which is why equilibrium is not necessarily a good thing. And systems maintain stability or stasis through fluctuations and adjustments. And if we're always growing or dying in a system, then we'd have to be constantly paying attention to stasis. And systems have input from the outside or they will implode. For example, simple system would be a thermostat in a house, right? Whereas this very simple little system, it's a single feedback loop where it takes the temperature and decides whether or not it needs to go on or off, right? So, but it has to have input from the outside or it'll implode. It's like if you had a flame in a jar and then you put a lid on the jar and cut off the oxygen, the flame's going to go out. That's also a system. And if you change one part of the system, you change the whole system. And that's the part I think we really find both exciting and dangerous, because no matter how small a change, it still has a ripple effect in the whole system. So we have to be really careful where we make the changes, where we do interventions in a system, because of course, it'll change the entire system, no matter how small. And the most flexible part of the system has the most control. That particular line was really interesting because I had a bunch of military officers in one of my classes, and they said, talk to me about this most flexible part of the system has the most control. And so I explained that to them. It doesn't have to be a significant part of the system. It doesn't have to be what we think is the most important part of the system. It could be something just tiny in the system that has the most control because it's the most flexible. And as I explained this to them, they started to understand. One of them had this aha moment about why, when we are working against an army, for example, in Afghanistan, why they can have so few resources and still have the upper hand. Because the most flexible part of the system can be one individual, right? It doesn't have to be a whole battalion of people. It can be one individual who is connected to the rest of the system enough that that one individual can actually control the whole system. Once they heard this, they started to realize, I know that sounds crazy, but they just started realizing why in places like Afghanistan and war that we could have fewer resources and still have more control over the situation. Because it depends on how it's organized, not so much how many elements are in it. So, and Margaret Wheatley talks about this in human systems, for example, leadership in organizations, where she talks about equilibrium It's not always a desirable state, but a system always wants to find equilibrium. It's always looking for balance, but the balance is oftentimes the path of least resistance. So we have to be observing what's going on so that we can have more control over it, because it will control itself. So with that, here are the elements that I think are the most interesting in systems. Systems are dynamic. They're either in the process of growing or dying, but they are dynamic. They are interdependent. Whatever I do can have a ripple effect on what you do and vice versa. If we do interventions in the system, it doesn't matter how big or how small the intervention is, it will still have an effect on the system. So when I teach leadership or strategy or something like that, for example, we talk about where do you intervene in the system. The smallest intervention that will have the largest impact is enormously important. People don't understand that. In organizations, they tend to think, well, it has to be an enormous, big intervention. No, it doesn't, just a small one. But intervening at the right place at the right time is what will make the difference, not the size of the intervention. And looking for pattern detection and sense making. This is going to the balcony and taking a look at the patterns in what's going on, whether it's a human body or whether it's an organization or whether it's a natural system in nature, right? And there will be ripple effects, right? Whatever we do to intervene in a system or any change that occurs will have a ripple effect. And of course, as you know, with ripple effect, you can drop a pebble in a stream or a pebble in a lake, and the ripple effect will magnify. And that's the beauty of what's going on in a system. One small little pebble in a lake will have a magnified ripple effect. And then there are also unintended consequences. So this is where we get caught up in trouble, because we don't realize without thinking into the system, into the future. So there's a system that exists now, but it also exists into the future. And if we don't pay attention to what we do now having a ripple effect into the future, we will have unintended consequences. So now you see the whole point. It's about the interconnectedness of things. And it's really quite shocking when we start thinking about how interconnected we all are. Like, I'll show you one out of healthcare, not healthcare systems, but public health, that I think will give you a better idea of intervening in a system and the ripple effects over time. So there's the static effect, but there's also the time effect. So I'll show you this little video. I'm assuming this is going to work, so let's see.
In the 1950s, the Dayak people of Borneo, an island in Southeast Asia, were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so they called the World Health Organization for help. The World Health Organization had a ready-made solution, which was to spray copious amounts of DDT around the island. With the application of DDT, the mosquitoes that carried the malaria were knocked down, and so was the malaria. There were some interesting side effects, though. The first was that the roofs of people's houses began to collapse on their heads. Turns out the DDT not only killed off the malaria-carrying mosquitoes, but it also killed a species of parasitic wasps that had controlled a population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch being what the roofs of the Dayak people's homes were made from. Without the wasps, the caterpillars multiplied and flourished and began munching their way through the villagers' roofs. That was just the beginning. The DDT affected a lot of the island's other insects, which were eaten by the resident population of small lizards called geckos. The biological half-life of DDT is around 8 years, so animals like geckos do not metabolize it very fast. It stays in their system for a long time. Over time, the geckos began to accumulate pretty high levels of DDT, and while they tolerated the DDT fairly well, the island's resident cats, which dined on the geckos, did not. The cats ate the geckos, and the DDT contained in the geckos killed the cats. With the cats gone, the island's population of rats came out to play. We all know what happens when rats multiply and flourish. Pretty soon the Dayak people were back on the phone to the World Health Organization, only this time it wasn't malaria that was the problem. It was the plague and the destruction of their grain stores, both of which were caused by the overpopulation of rats. This time, though, the World Health Organization didn't have a ready-made solution and had to invent one. What did they do? They decided to parachute live cats into Borneo. Operation Cat Drop occurred courtesy of the Royal Air Force and eventually stabilized the situation.
So you start to see where Roger's stuff comes in, right? Because if we use creativity appropriately with systems thinking, then we can actually create a better future. If we use creativity without systems thinking, we can actually create unintended consequences, right? And as simple as this seems, it's a whole new way of thinking. Once we start grasping that almost everything out there is a system within a system within a system, we start realizing, if we don't realize that, we have all these unintended consequences. And I think we all see that we're living through many of those now. Because a system is a group of interacting, interrelated, or interdependent components that form a complex and unified whole, not just at the moment, but also into the future. Systems can be intangible or tangible, or they're naturally occurring. Some are human-made, some are made of humans, right? So if we start learning to think and see things this way, not just the work that we do. I mean, I do leadership, so I look at organizations, but I also have to look at everything else as a system out there too, because the minute we start understanding thinking that way, we actually have more positive impact and have fewer surprises. For example, I'm sure many of you have noticed, just in COVID was a huge systemic effect, but it also had ripple effects on things that we would never have imagined if we weren't thinking about it. The ripple effect on our politics, the ripple effect on our economics, the ripple effect on our relationships with other countries. COVID was the catalyst for starting this, but the ripple effect is huge because it makes other events or things to happen that are opportunistic. Sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad. But if we don't think about what will be the ripple effect of this, we end up being caught off guard. And that's where we get in trouble as human beings, and whether it's a human system or a natural system. So the ripple effect of all of this. So here's some natural systems that I give you examples, because these examples are just all over the place, all of these intertwined, interconnected things. Once we start recognizing the interconnectedness of stuff, it changes our entire worldview, our Weltanschauung. So here's some great examples from natural systems. For example, one of my favorite metaphors, but it's also a truth, is aspen groves. Aspen groves are a fantastic system. If you know anything about them, Roger and I grew up in Colorado, so we know aspen groves, but aspen trees have a very interesting difference from all other trees. Aspen groves are all one root system with trees popping up. Other trees have their own root systems. Other types of trees have their own root systems, but aspens are all one root system. So if anything happens over here in the root system, it is eventually going to have an effect on the entire aspen grove, which is not necessarily true of other trees that are separate entities. All one root system with, trees popping up. Beautiful metaphor too, I might add. I love that metaphor for an organization too. But that's a natural system. There's another natural system that I really think is fantastic. It has to do with birds and how they interact with one another. For example, birds are able to demonstrate amazing coordination as a system of alignment, and with thousands of independent bodies that move as one, reacting together in nanoseconds to changes in geography, topography, wind currents, potential predators. How do these birds do this in a way that is, by the way, way more effective as a system than human beings are? And they've got brains the size of a peanut, right? But these birds are able to figure out somehow collectively, without opposing thumbs or abstract language, how to communicate with one another to put themselves in safety. And scientists are starting to study all of these systems so that we can apply these metaphors to ourselves and perhaps become a little bit less perilous to ourselves. But they've discovered, at least so far, that there are 3 simple rules that govern the interaction of these birds that are flocking. They maintain a minimum distance from their neighbor, which is very interesting. They fly at the same speed as their neighbor, and they always turn towards the center. And the 3 rules are essential for flocking. And when they're in place, it's as if all the birds collectively see what each bird sees and responds as each bird responds. It's a system that works with all kinds of interdependent and independent parts. So I'll give you an example of this. These are starlings in California. So isn't that interesting that natural elements of nature, living creatures in nature, have more sense than we do around how to interact with one another? And I use this for teaching leadership in organizations because, if they're always turning towards the center, the question is, what is your center? What is the center that you would all be wanting to turn towards? In healthcare, because that's most of my clients are in healthcare, the center is always the patient. And once we figure that out, then everybody sort of nicely flocks toward that. But if we don't remind them of that, they can get caught up in just the daily, well, just get her done, just get her done. Let's, the linear idea of all these activities that we have to do and just get her done. But they add up. And we, a systems thinker, will be paying attention to how they add up. Do they add up to where we want to go? Or are they going to add up to trying to find equilibrium in ways that are really the path of least resistance, which is not a sustainable strategy? So, what might our center be? There's another one that I wanted to share with you that I thought you would really appreciate, from Bill Bryson. If you know who Bill Bryson is, a beautiful writer, incredible writer. He wrote a book called A Short History of Nearly Everything. And if you haven't read it, it is fantastic read. I actually listened to him read his own book, and it was a spectacular experience. It was actually life-changing. But in the very beginning of the introduction, let me give you this example of a human system that is just beautiful. A system, not a static system, but a system over time, over lots of time. And in his introduction, he says, for example, have you ever considered the miracle of you? Have you ever considered what an unbelievable miracle it is that you're sitting in that chair today? The odds are so against that it's nothing short of a miracle that you even exist. So this is Bryson's take on this. Robert, I think of you every time I read this because it makes me think of just the essence of who you are and what you believe too. But here's what Bryson said. He said, not only have you been lucky enough to be attached since time immemorial to a favored evolutionary line, but you've also been extremely, make that miraculously, fortunate in your personal ancestry. Consider the fact that for 3.8 billion years, a period of time older than the Earth's mountains and rivers and oceans, every one of your forebears on both sides has been attractive enough to find a mate, healthy enough to reproduce, sufficiently blessed by fate and circumstances to live long enough to do so. Not one of your pertinent ancestors was squashed, devoured, drowned, starved, stranded, stuck fast, untimely wounded, or otherwise deflected from life's quest of delivering a tiny charge of genetic material to the right partner at the right moment in order to perpetuate the only possible sequence of hereditary combinations that could result eventually and astoundingly and all too briefly in you. Isn't that an incredible systems theory paragraph? I mean, think about that, the system that exists and then the system it becomes and the effect on the future. That's systems thinking, the interconnectedness of everything that occurs. And I just love that. If you think about how unlikely is it? I mean, first of all, our cavemen forebears had to be attractive enough to find a mate, just that alone. It's pretty miraculous. So this is really just a lesson in looking at everything in terms of systems and the and the effect on each other in terms of that interconnectedness. So in addition to that, a couple of other things, and then we'll talk about this because I think it's worthy definitely of a conversation. Here's another system. I love this one. This actually comes from Deepak Chopra. Perfect example of where systems theory came from, because Deepak is, of course, a medical doctor and also a Buddhist. And he combines these thoughts together, and he just talks about the wisdom of a cell. And yet it's a metaphor for how human beings should be. It's how our body works, how the cells in our body work, but it's also how human beings could be with one another. He says the wisdom of our cells. Each cell is a noble purpose. Every cell in your body agrees to work for the welfare of the whole. For a cell, selfishness is not an option. Communion. A cell keeps in touch with every other cell. For a cell, withdrawing or refusing to communicate is not an option. Cells have a level of awareness. They adapt from moment to moment. For a cell, getting caught up in rigid habits is not an option. Now you're starting to see how systems interact with each other. And these are just our cells inside our bodies. Creativity, although every cell has a unique function, these combine in creative ways, so clinging to old behavior is not an option. Always growing or dying. Acceptance, cells recognize each other as equally important. For a cell, going it alone is not an option. This is how our cells work. This is how human beings can work. We start looking at the way systems work, especially when they're working optimally. That gives us an idea of how we actually might behave toward one another if we look at the human interaction system. So, interdependencies, all these kinds of things. Here's another form of systems theory, relationships. So say, for example, Roger and I have been friends for a very, very long time. And in our system, there's Roger and there's me, but there's a third element in our system that's called the relationship. So the interdependency of my friendship with Roger creates a third entity, which is the relationship itself, which also means that that third entity, if we look at that system, the interconnectedness and the system itself, and every now and then if we run into some kind of a snag, all we have to do is go to the relationship and ask it what it needs, as opposed to what Roger might need or what I might need. Relationship itself might need something. For example, Friday night, my husband and I were talking about going out for dinner, and I want Chinese food and he wants Italian, and he said, but we had Chinese last week and you got to choose last week and blah, blah, blah. Or we could go to the relationship and ask it what it needs. And what it needs is for us to have a wonderful time eating whatever and enjoying each other's company, because we haven't seen each other for the week. When you ask the system itself sometimes what it needs, it gives us better answers. So there are all kinds of ways that that systems play out. Here are some of the ones. We've got software that actually maps networks. And here's human networks, for example. This is an organization where we're trying to figure out how to get people more interconnected because they're operating against one another without intending to. And the ripple effect of their individual group behaviors is actually having a negative effect. So we map the interactions of the human beings in the system. And we can see who is connected to who, and we can also see who's not connected. I'll show you a couple of others of these. These are how we map a human system and see the interconnectedness. It's absolutely fascinating. And then you can also realize that if you move one of these dots, right, which is an individual, and connect it to a different dot, the whole system itself shifts. It's actually just moved two dots in this picture to connect with one another, and the whole system itself shifts, proving again that one move in a system has an effect on the whole system. So that what's beautiful about that is recognizing then the intervention might just be one spot. It doesn't have to be a whole reorganization or anything else. Just one move can actually shift the whole thing. So here's another one. This one happens to be the state of California. It's one of our state entities. It's actually housing and community development, which really is in charge of homelessness. And we mapped the interactions that the department had with every other entity out there in the state of California who would be helpful in terms of help fixing homelessness, and recognizing that there are a whole bunch of these entities, see around the edge here, a whole bunch of these entities who are not connected at all to the department. And that means that there's no way we're ever going to be able to fix homelessness, because these entities have to be interdependent. They can't be working independently, or we actually will only be fixing symptoms. This one, I love this one. This one's my favorite. This actually is NASA. We mapped the interconnections inside JPL and NASA on the Mars project. And we mapped all of the relationships and all the working relationships and so on. And you see this one pod that's in the upper right corner. They're not connected to anybody. And you can't do a Mars landing without these people being connected. They're off doing their own thing. And the danger in that, of course, is something's not going to work right. Or if it does, it's going to be by accident. So these are the human connections at JPL and NASA, just in terms of a human system. So remember, the most flexible elements control the system. So it doesn't matter where it is or who it is. It's the most flexible part. So you'll find in a human organization, for example, that the most flexible part might be an admin who sits at a desk and sees everybody. The information goes there first and goes out of there first. They might have they might be the hub of the whole pod, but they might be somebody way deep in the organization who really can have control over the organization, not because they like the power, but because they have they're the most flexible part of the system. So that's what you look for, is where's the most flexible part, right? And I think this is, wait a minute, I can't remember. Oh, I know, this is something else. I'm going to skip that for a second. So, systemic ripple effects, for example. Right now we have, Nancy Levin has this wonderful quote about the fact that we should now be, at this period of time, we should be honoring this moment between the no longer and the not yet, the post-COVID moment, or the move from where we've been to where we're going, and talking about, rather than just letting it take us there, maybe we should be deciding where we want to be taken. And another fellow who's in leadership said, as in our desire to return to normal, maybe we should take a look at what parts of normal are actually worth going back to, because it will have an enormous effect on our system going forward in the future. And as humans, I'm not sure we're in a good place to just be reactive. I think we need to be a little more proactive about how we want our future to look. John Shar says the future is not some place where we're going to, but one we're creating, even unintentionally. And the paths are not to be found, but made. And the activity of making them, just as in a system, changes both the maker and the destination. So when I thought about putting this together, I thought this is going to be complicated. What do I want to tell these highly intelligent folks who work in human systems all day long, every day? But I wanted to give you a sense of they're everywhere. The systems exist absolutely everywhere, and they are interdependent in some ways with one another in ways that we don't even necessarily realize. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you all today, to understand, or at least give the beginnings of systems theory. You all work in systems, you all understand that, but they're also all around you in every imaginable kind of way. And once we start to look at everything in terms of systems and interdependencies and ripple effects and so on, once we start to think that way about everything, then it also forces us to make healthier choices, because every choice has a ripple effect. And anticipating that ripple effect is part of our job. And throwing in creativity to try to make sure that we are making optimal choices and optimizing our outcomes, that's where creativity comes in. That's where creativity becomes king. So let's talk for a few minutes about all of this, and hopefully I gave you a little taste of where they all exist, because they're everywhere, and why it's important to see the world that way. So let's talk about this. How can this relate to you, and in what ways can I be helpful I mean, that's what I'd really like to know. So, Roger, if I toss it back to you, what else do you all want to know about?
Reed, first off, thank you so much. This was some of the best explanation of systems thinking I've seen. So cogent, so well put together, but that's what you do. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And so let's just open it up. Questions for Larry, comments for Larry. Michael, you've got something, so just jump on in.
Yeah, I loved all of that. That was really great, and illuminated things that I think I maybe had kind of understood a little bit. And that kind of gets at what my main question is. Initially, my first thought was the people who have problems with system-based thinking, it exists in their blind spot. And then I was thinking further, and I was like, yeah, the times that I've had trouble with system-based thinking, it existed in my blind spot. So do you have a method or a way to get people, it can kind of also feel like an attack too, like you're not thinking about the system. It could be an attack on someone, could not view that very pleasantly. Do you have a way to bring people up to speed quickly and empathetically? And
Yeah, and that's what I love about it, because it's a very, very complicated and complex process to understand, and yet even a little kid can understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So the trick is really around, and Michael, you do improv, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you're giving somebody an improv a prompt, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're actually creating a system.
Mm-hmm.
The prompt itself has a ripple effect, and see what people do with it. You go, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
look what they do with this kind of stuff, right? So the simple answer to your question is questions. Asking people questions, rather than expecting them to see things in systems, because people get caught up in the left brain, the linear stuff all the time. It's just get her done. Let's get her done. Let's get her done. About just asking them, have you thought about who all this will affect?
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about who all will be positively affected by this choice? Who all will be possibly negatively affected by this choice? Have you thought about the ripple effect of what you're doing? And it's also in the tone of voice that makes the difference too. But it's really in questioning, getting people, just asking them. I've got an acronym that called the listening laws that I really like when you're listening to people and you really want to keep it from turning into conflict or a disagreement or an argument, is to just tell them what you like about what they're saying, what you would add to what they're saying, what you're worried about what they're saying, and so what do they think they could do about that, right? So I did this with my daughter. She was 16. She said, I'm 16 now, it's time for me to have a car. And I said, well, I like that you're thinking about becoming more independent, right? There's by the way, no way she was at all responsible enough to get a car. And so I like the fact that you're thinking about becoming more independent. What I would add is, with independence comes a lot of responsibility, because what I'm worried about is I haven't seen enough places where you have demonstrated that kind of responsibility yet. So what do you think we could do about that? And then you just be quiet and let them do the thinking about it, which I think is probably one of the best ways to imagine it. I'll give you another thing about that, Michael, that's really interesting, because I see everything in systems, right? I mean, I teach human behavior, but I see everything in systems. One of the things we know about conflict, just as a great example of systems thinking in human behavior, is that the trajectory of conflict, the path that it takes, is totally dependent on the person who responds to the initial conflict, not who creates it, not who brings it up, but how they respond to it. The person, so say for example, you and I are in conflict and I'm really angry with you about it, and I say, I can't believe you did that. How you respond to that is what creates the trajectory of the conflict. Even if you didn't cause it, how you respond to it as the responder creates the trajectory that it takes, the ripple effect.
Yeah.
So this is exactly the question you were asking me. How do you keep it from turning into conflict, right?
Yeah.
Recognizing where the point is in the system that sends things forward makes an enormous difference in the choices that we would make around our behaviors. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really great. I like all of that as well.
Okay, good.
So Michael, you have your hand up
Michael.
over there. He's got his hand up.
The Michaels have questions. So again, thank you so much. This was really fantastic. And you know, the word that keeps coming to mind as I was listening, this is really validating. So, you know, I'm not the average physician, you know, with my role overseeing safety for a large healthcare system. I have to kind of live in the world that you were describing. So as you were using the terms interdependence and ripple effect, where my brain was going, and I kept hearing a really good colleague of mine who's a Lean Six Sigma expert, we refer to them as balancing measures. So when I implement something into the system, to paraphrase him, what could potentially go horribly wrong? So thinking about the consequences, not just the positive of what we think is going to improve, but also what's potentially not going to improve. You know, the classic ones in healthcare currently, and I'm sorry for those folks who, you know, kind of hear this over and over, but, you know, we work so hard to decrease length of stay for our patients, get them home quicker, increase capacity in hospitals. As you know, we're having major challenges with, you know, with beds and staffing. But what could go horribly wrong if you reduce the patient's length of stay? They wind up coming back and getting readmitted, which is not good for anybody. That actually taxes not only the patient and family, but also the system itself. You know, reduce using opioids and narcotics. You know, we have a national epidemic of substance use. But what could go horribly wrong if I don't prescribe the right amount of pain meds? Patients in pain. And then winds up again back, you know, kind of re-entering the system. So thinking that way, and I'm just kind of just speaking to step one. There's a whole, like you said, almost like a cascade effect as that goes forward. So where I'm going with this is I think that everything you're describing is in healthcare systems, but I think it's only seen by a minority of us, those of us who are kind of forced to live in the world based on either our jobs or our interests. It's got to be introduced into healthcare education. And I'm purposely not saying medical school because it's not just the physicians. It's our NPs, it's our PAs, it's our RNs, it's our physical. I mean, everybody needs to better understand the systems that they're living with. And again, I just love that phrase that my colleague uses. You know, how could, you know, what could potentially go horribly wrong if I introduce something into the system? And then I'm just going to throw one little challenge to one of the things that you mentioned. You absolutely want to have that center that everybody can move toward. But I'm going to push a little bit, and I 100%, you know, patients are, you know, a key driver. You know, they are why we are here. But I would also argue they're not always the center. You know, one of the things that became crystal clear out of the pandemic and in the kind of the wake of the pandemic is that our healthcare providers often are also, if not always, also in the center of what we do. Because there's, you know, there's an interdependence and a ripple effect too. If we just keep telling our healthcare workers to do more, work harder, provide more service, provide better service, the unintended consequence of that is that we burn them out. And as you probably know, you know, we've lost thousands and thousands of nurses from our healthcare system. Physicians are leaving the system, and they're not coming back. And what is it? What, you know, what we thought, well, maybe after the pandemic, people will start coming back when things normal. It's not happening. It's certainly not to the numbers that we were hoping. So I think, you know, I don't know if you can have multiple centers or if you can put multiple groups in the center, but thinking, I think some of the kind of with nothing but great intentions, but the focus almost too much on just the patient, I think actually has created some of the problems we're trying to undo now.
You know, first of all, I agree with you 1,000%. This is so much of what I'm doing and have been doing during the pandemic. There are dependencies and there are interdependencies. We have been, you know, it was the quadruple aim. That's why we added the fourth one, which is don't burn out the care workers. Because the dependency is we exist for the patients, but on the other hand, the dependency is that we have staff that we are taking care of and who feel safe and who feel like they are capable of doing the work because they're not so tired. Michael, the other thing that we found out too, so you're absolutely right. There are multiple centers or there are dependencies. But one of the things I've changed out here, because I work mostly in healthcare here, and everybody is being trained in systems thinking. Everybody, the IT folks and the nurses, I mean, everybody. But one of the things that we've been tripping over is this whole thing, they've been using this mantra for 3 years. Like, quit saying this to people. Self-care is important for care workers because if you take care of yourself, you can take better care of others. That's only half of the equation. And this is what a campaign we've got going out here about self-care is important because you matter. Not just because your care of a patient matters. They're not just robots that we're working through to get care to the patients. They are human beings as well. And if we don't take care of that part of the system, then the rest of the system falls apart, and it is falling apart. And I would also add to you that what they're suffering from is not just burnout. It's called moral injury. Are you familiar with the concept? They're suffering.
Unfortunately, very much so.
Yeah. So you know what I'm saying. And if we start to look at it, the moral injury is part of the problem, then we have a whole different way of having to solve it. Burnout is not solved. Burnout's solved one way, but moral injury is solved in a whole other way. And so if you look at the system and really diagnose what's going on, it's moral injury. And we better start solving for that. So I agree with you. Whether there are multiple centers or not, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. But there are multiple dependencies, for sure.
Yeah,
So
no, I like that way of framing it. That's great. Thank you so much.
I so agree with you. So let's see, you've got Charity and Dr. Roberts got their hand up too. So Charity, do you want to ask me a question and then I'll come to you, Doc?
Yes, thank you so much. This was just amazing and fascinating, and I feel like it's a day in my life as someone who's trying to train healthcare leaders in all of this systems thinking. And my original thought when I raised my hand was a little bit different, but I'm actually going to add on to what Dr. Leonard was just speaking about with an example. So yes, culture, we're trying to train that the patient is the center, and then trying to fix the staffing issue. So we're trying to recruit. And a decision was made in our system to bring back instructor-led orientations. So instead of online, which was what we were doing during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So we're doing these instructor-led now. And we were first told we would put caps on each weekly amount of people we were bringing in. But when they saw that we need more people, they're saying no caps. But what they failed to see is the capacity, not only of the training team, but of the facilities. So now we're packing 75 people into a room that only comfortably seats 50.